When you grow up around here, you learn pretty early that some places carry their history differently than others. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with signs, markers, or warnings nailed to a post. It just stays, settled into the land, into the river bends, into the way old folks pause when they drive past a certain stretch of road, even if they don't tell you why. And one small Appalachian town is one of those places. On the surface, it looks like any other Appalachian town that learned how to survive on one industry, and then learned, slowly, how to survive without it. A river town, a working town, a place where generations showed up every day, did hard jobs, and trusted what stood above them would keep on standing. And most nights, that trust held. But every now and then, history reminds you that progress doesn't always fail quickly. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it holds. Sometimes it looks solid enough that people stop imagining what could happen if it isn't. Christmas Eve 1924 started out just like any other Christmas Eve in these mountains. It was cold, damp, but festive. Families were home, kids snuggled in their bed. Lights were glowing in the windows, and above it all, unnoticed by most, something man-made sat quietly in the dark, doing exactly what it always had done. That is, until it didn't. This story isn't about monsters, ghosts, or folklore you hear around a campfire. It's about faith in organizations, confidence in those who you felt you could trust, and about a town built on grit and industry. About what happens when people grow used to living beneath something they were told was safe. Because in Appalachia, when something goes wrong, it doesn't always come with a warning shot. Sometimes it just arrives, and once it does, it almost always certainly comes with a vengeance. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, The Real Appalachia. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. Saltville, Virginia, or Saltville, as some call it, is a small Appalachian town, shaped by salt and shadowed by tragedy. It sits in a narrow valley along the north fork of the Holston River, in the far southwestern part of Virginia, surrounded by tall ridges that once held positions that protected the town. If you live here, you never notice the beauty of these places. The mountains weren't someplace you visited. They were something that shaped how you spoke, how you worked, and how you understood danger. The town owes its very existence, not to what you see, but what you can't see, what is underneath it. For centuries, long before the factories and rail lines, animals have been drawn there, following the salt that seeped up through the marshy springs. Native people knew it. Early settlers learned it quick. Salt was life in those days, essential for preserving meat and survival. And Saltville had so much of it that the town became a prized asset. And once people figured out how valuable salt really was, the valley stopped being just another small community and became something worth fighting for. By the time of the Civil War, Saltville wasn't just important, it was strategic. The Confederacy depended on it. Known as the salt capital of the Confederacy, 2/3 of the salt feeding Southern troops came out of that valley, boiled down from brine in iron salt kettles, shipped all over the South to keep the soldiers fed. That importance brought war right to Saltville's doorstep. The valley was fortified with earthwork trenches and cannons placed on the ridges. Defended by regiments of the Confederate Home Guard, old men and young boys stood watch. 2 battles raged here in the fall and winter of 1864. The first battle in October saw the Confederates fending off the Union attack, but that battle ended in infamy, which is worthy of its own episode. The second battle, in December 1864, allowed Union General Stoneman to seize Saltville and torch the salt works. However, here in Appalachia, things don't go away that easily. Within months, the locals had rebuilt, and Saltville was once again back to boiling brine. The land had soaked up the blood of war, but they knew the salt works had to continue. After the Civil War, Saltville, like a lot of places in Appalachia, struggled to rebuild, but the little town's mineral riches still beckoned. And in the late 19th century, new investors arrived with industrial dreams. Saltville gradually transformed into a classic Appalachian company town, its fortunes tied to a single powerful business. In 1894, a British-born engineer named Thomas Matheson opened the Matheson Alkali Works along the river in Saltville. He was drawn by the valley's unique geology, not just the salt, but limestone and other minerals ideal for chemical manufacturing. The Matheson plant initially produced soda ash, a critical ingredient for glass, soap, and textiles. By 1986, Matheson Alkali was turning out the nation's first commercially available bleaching powder for laundry, chemicals that made modern life cleaner, brighter, more efficient. And with the plant came jobs, good ones, by the standards of the day, steady pay, in a region where steady work was hard to come by. Houses went up, neat rows of company homes, all built alike, all owned by the company, all close enough to the plant that the steam whistle could set the rhythm of the day. Saltville became a company town in the way Appalachia knows all too well. One local resident later recalled that Saltville had become a stereotypical Appalachian company town, where the residents were owned and operated by the town's business. There was pride in the good-paying jobs the plant provided, but also an implied understanding. The company's needs came first, and few dared to cross the Matheson empire that effectively ran Saltville. The company didn't just employ you. It shaped your life. It owned the land, the houses, the stores where you bought your food, sometimes even the paper where you read the news. You didn't talk about it like that, though. You talked about the gratitude. You talked about the putting food on the table. You talked about how lucky you were to have work when other towns didn't. And most folks meant that. But every industry leaves something behind. In the early 1900s, the plant processes were generating a new problem from its manufacturing: chemical waste. Making soda ash and other alkalis left behind a thick, sludgy residue of lime, ash, and chemical byproducts. And what do you do with tons of foul, muck, as it was referred to by the locals, that you can't ship or sell? The company did exactly what made sense to them at the time. They built a dam. And in 1906, construction began, but not as a dam in the traditional sense. Not a concrete wall, not steel reinforced. No, but an earthen structure made largely from the waste itself, piled up and compacted, layer by layer, to hold back a growing pond of milky white muck. The locals began calling this the Muck Dam. At first it was small and manageable, but as the company's production increased, so did the waste. So the dam began to grow, taller and wider, and year after year it rose along the north bank of the river, until it stretched across dozens of acres and towered above the communities below, the communities of Palmertown, Henrytown, and Chinch Row. These were clusters of company houses and family farms, home to many Matheson workers and their families. Imagine an enormous artificial embankment made essentially of dried slurry, holding back a lake of poisonous mud the consistency of wet plaster. And imagine living in its shadow, perhaps a few hundred yards downstream. Generations of local people got used to it. The dam was just part of the landscape, a chalky white plateau above the town where nothing grew. Children played beneath it. Workers walked by it daily on their way to the plant, hardly giving it a second glance. It had been there for years, and as far as anyone knew, it had never been a cause for concern. And when something holds together long enough, people stop believing it could ever fail. By December 1924, the Muck Dam stretched over 30 acres along the bank of the Holston River. In some spots it towered over 100 feet high, as tall as a 10-story building, looming directly above the communities below. And with no safety regulations or inspectors to oversee Matheson's private waste reservoir, the people of Palmertown slept in the shadow of danger without even realizing it. The week before Christmas in 1924, it had been raining. Not a heavy rain, but a steady rain. Just days of steady drizzle that soaked into the earth and didn't quite let up. As the week went on, the river ran higher than usual, brown with silt, and on Wednesday of that week, just above Palmertown, the Muck pond began taking on more water. The earthen walls were growing heavy and soft, though no one down below was watching closely, not even thinking about the dam, because they had other things on their mind, something way more exciting. It was Christmas Eve. Fires were burning low in stoves, supper dishes washed and stacked, children put to bed early, with tomorrow waiting for them. Lights from lamps spilled from windows of company houses, yellow against the damp darkness of the night. Some folks gathered with family. Some were visiting neighbors. In Palmertown, a house was filled with children's voices as a Christmas party carried on. Elsewhere, men sat with coffee, talking over old stories. In a store just down the road, a group of men and boys listened to a radio broadcast as it wound down for the night. And sitting up above them all was the Muck Dam. Around 8 o'clock, a strange sound rolled through the Saltville Valley. Not scary enough to send people running, just a deep bang, followed by a low rumble that some thought was thunder, and others figured something was going on at the plant. In a company town like Saltville, you were used to hearing strange sounds day and night, and you didn't pay much attention to them, as that was the case with this one. But then the sound grew, deeper and wider, and people began to realize that this wasn't normal. Something was definitely wrong. And in that moment, before anyone could run, before anyone could shout, the dam gave way. A massive section of the earthen dam collapsed, releasing the entire contents of the waste pond in one gush. One moment there was a valley, lit by soft lamps, radios, and Christmas anticipation. The next, there was noise deep and rolling, like something massive shifting its weight all at once. As folks were trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, the sound continued to get louder and louder. And what came down the valley wasn't water. It didn't splash or ripple. It moved as a single body, thick, heavy, and fast, carrying with it trees, rock, and debris. Witnesses later said it looked like white in the dark, pale enough to stand out against the night sky, like a moving hillside coming loose. House walls began collapsing, and roofs were lifted off and broken apart. Floors buckled and disappeared into the night. It hit the river with so much power, the river began flowing backwards, sending water and debris upstream into Henrytown, destroying houses well beyond where anyone thought the danger from the dam could ever reach. In one house, a man stepped onto his porch to investigate the noise. Just as the wave arrived, the force tore him off his feet and hurled him clear through the structure, throwing him about 50 feet into the yard behind it. When he staggered up, injured and stunned, the house he'd just stepped out of was gone, and inside that house was his brother, who had vanished into the darkness. In another home, a family gathered around a warm room, some with their coats still on from a recent visit, children upstairs settling for bed. They never had time to run. The house didn't just collapse. It disappeared, leaving no walls, no furniture, and no sign of the people who had been inside. Down the valley, in a store where the men and boys had gathered around a radio, the broadcast was ending, as he did in those days, with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, was playing across the radio, and as those words filled the room, the ground shook. Outside, the sound reached them, and before the prayer could finish, someone ran into the store screaming that the dam had broken. By the time the alarm spread, Palmertown was already gone. What followed was confusion layered on top of disbelief. Neighbors grabbed lanterns as they ran towards the sound. Some didn't understand what they were seeing when they arrived. A white coating on everything. The whole landscape had changed, and drifting through the air was a smell of chemicals mixed with wet dirt. Then they began hearing voices, crying, wailing, and calling out. and then the rescue work began. Men tied ropes around their waists and stepped into the muck, which sucked at their legs and burned their skin anywhere it touched their bare flesh. They waded forward slowly, probing with poles, feeling for anything solid that might be a person or a piece of debris that could be moved. Bonfires were built from broken furniture, fence rails, and remnants of destroyed houses, just to give enough light to see where to step. Every rescue felt like a miracle, and every body that was recovered felt like a failure. In one collapsed house, rescuers heard faint voices coming from above them. They called out, and a child answered. 2 little girls, sisters who had survived by sheer chance, their bed, still intact, lodged against the remains of a roof beam, suspended above the muck while everything below them had been torn away. They had spent the entire night scared, crying, calling out for their parents who would never answer. Hardened men cried openly as they carried the little girls down from the debris and out of the muck, as they continually asked for their mom and dad, men weeping, knowing that the little girls' parents were gone. In another place, a family survived by climbing onto a floating timber that had drifted through their collapsing home. Hanging on it like a makeshift lifeboat, they rode it through the darkness and debris until they could grab branches and pull themselves to safety. Not everyone was that lucky. The wave of the muck raced on, flattening everything in its path for nearly a mile. As the sun rose on Christmas morning over the Saltville Valley, the ground was not coated in snow, but a white, chalky chemical waste. Someone later said it looked like a field of snow, except nothing about it was clean. That Christmas, no presents were opened, no dinners were shared. The holiday passed quietly, under the weight of tragedy, and when the work finally slowed, when the fires burned out and the rescue ropes were untied, Saltville was left standing in the aftermath, staring at a truth that didn't fit neatly into blame or forgiveness. The mountain hadn't moved on its own, but it had come down all the same. Saltville didn't look like a town that had survived a disaster. It looked like a place that had been scraped clean and left behind. Where Palmertown had once stood, there was now a wide stretch of pale, chalky ground, coated in drying muck that cracked when you walked on it. The river itself was unrecognizable, clogged with muck and debris, and pushed out of its natural path by the sheer volume of waste that had come down the river bottom. Trees lay uprooted and stripped bare, their branches locked in place by the hardened white residue. Pieces of houses, a door frame here, a roof beam there, were scattered as if someone had shaken the valley and let everything fall where it may. People walked slowly, carefully around the muck, still calling out names they already knew wouldn't answer. More than one rescuer would carry scars from that night for the rest of their life, white chemical burns etched into their legs and arms, quiet reminders of what they'd waded into without hesitation, just stepping up to help their friends and neighbors, willing to sacrifice themselves to help others. Heroes, no doubt. Searchers kept working, pulling bodies from the hardened muck. It was a daunting task, not just because of the work, but because they were recovering people they knew, friends, neighbors, family. The recovery work was slow. Some bodies were found quickly. Some took days. Others took weeks. A few were even found far from where their homes stood, carried downstream on a tide that had no regard for life. The dead were laid out where they could be, covered with sheets until they could be moved. The undertaker's place began filling up fast, too fast. By the time the final counts were made, in total, 19 people were gone, 12 of them children, making this the deadliest dam failure in Virginia's history. The ages of the victims ranged from 72 years to just 10 months. There were whole families wiped out in a single stroke, parents and babies lost together, siblings taken while sleeping in the same room. Left behind were many spaces that would never be filled again, chairs at tables that would stay empty, long after the Christmas decorations were packed away. Someone would later say that Christmas didn't come to Saltville that year. It just passed on by. In the days that followed, Debris from the disaster made its way over 150 miles to Knoxville, Tennessee. People downriver in Kingsport, Tennessee, were gathering fish by the thousands that were blinded and suffocated by the white alkali muck, being told they were edible by just simply washing them off. And back in Saltville, the town moved the way mountain towns always do after a tragedy, quietly and humbly. Funerals were held, sometimes more than one at a time. Small coffins lined up at church altars. Hymns were sung through clenched throats. Food was carried from house to house. By all accounts, Matheson Alkali Works moved quickly to provide aid and present itself as being responsive during the crisis. The company's leadership, perhaps keenly aware of the potential blame, marshaled resources immediately. They set up an emergency hospital at the company's store and brought in doctors by train and automobile from nearby towns. They provided lumber and crews to build temporary shelters for those left homeless. Matheson also pledged money. The company donated $2,000, a large sum in 1924, towards a relief fund for the victims. The governor of Virginia sent a telegram on December 26 expressing his deepest regrets at the sad catastrophe and sympathy for the stricken families. And what of the Muck Dam itself? Matheson wasted no time there either. They knew that production at the plant must go on. The company rerouted the chemical waste into a natural sinkhole nearby as a temporary measure, and soon began constructing a new, supposedly safer, dam a bit further away from residences. The ruins of Palmertown were a total loss. Once the search for bodies concluded and the monumental task of clearing the muck was underway, Matheson oversaw the complete leveling of the old neighborhood. In its place, they built a new set of houses on higher ground and offered them to the survivors who had just lost their homes. The company named this town Perryville, some say after a Matheson official, or perhaps simply because it was the name of a nearby road. To this day, Perryville still stands as a residential area in Saltville. Local newspapers at the time praised Matheson Alkali for its generous and voluntary assistance. Surprisingly, no anger was publicly directed towards the company that built the dam, at least not in the initial aftermath. Perhaps people felt that blaming Matheson outright would be like blaming the backbone of their town. Saltville literally existed because of the salt and chemical works. To condemn the company was almost unthinkable for the many who depended on it. That doesn't mean questions weren't asked. In the weeks after, officials did inquire about the cause of the dam collapse, and several theories began circulating through the community. And just like today, the rumor mill began. Someone said sabotage. Someone else said an explosion. For a brief time, a man was even arrested, accused of blowing the dam out of spite for not getting hired by the plant. But nothing came of it. No evidence held, and no charges stuck. The more likely explanation was also the least dramatic. The dam had been built up over time, raised higher and higher without the kind of reinforcement that might have held under pressure. Days of rain had soaked it through. The weight became too much, and a wall failed. No single villain, no single moment of recklessness anyone wanted to name out loud. When you grow up around here, you learn that survival often means accepting what can't be undone, and finding a way forward without reopening wounds you still have to live with. The plant kept operating. The river slowly recovered. Children born after 1924 grew up hearing fragments of the story, never the whole thing at once, not in any school books, not on a plaque, just in pieces, passed during a heavy rain, or when Christmas Eve came around and someone went quiet for a moment, drifted off into their thoughts. In the years that followed the disaster, Saltville did what Appalachian towns have always done when the ground beneath them shifts. It keeps going. The plant didn't close. In fact, it grew. Ownership changed hands over time, and eventually the operation became Olin Matheson Chemical Corporation, a name that would come to define Saltville for generations afterwards. With that came stability, paychecks, and a kind of prosperity that was rare in these mountains, especially in the middle of the 20th century. For a while, Saltville thrived. There were hotels where travelers stayed, drawn by industry and businesses instead of salt springs and furnaces. There was a bowling alley where families spent Friday nights, a movie theater where kids lined up on the weekends, nickels and dimes in hands, watching the world flicker across the screen, far removed from the valley they lived in. There was a golf course carved out of the hills, manicured in green, a sign that Saltville had become more than just a place to work. It had become a place to live. They even fielded a semi-pro baseball team, whose name came as no surprise, the Saltville Alkalis. On summer evenings, folks gathered to watch games, to cheer, to sit shoulder to shoulder and forget for a few hours that the town's foundation had been built on extraction and risk. And for a time, it worked. The whistle still blew. The lights still came on. The town felt, to its residents, that it had outrun its past. But as you know, history has a way of coming back around. Long after the Muck Dam faded from living memory, long after Palmertown disappeared from the map, literally, another truth began to surface. Quieter, slower, and harder to ignore. The chemicals that powered Saltville's prosperity didn't vanish when production stopped. They lingered. By the time Olin had shut down operations in the early 1970s, the land and river carried a legacy that couldn't be scrubbed away with time or renamed neighborhoods. The Holston River, once choked by the white muck in 1924, now carried contamination that stretched far beyond its town limits. Eventually, Saltville became a Superfund site. A Superfund site is a place the Environmental Protection Agency has marked as dangerously contaminated, land or water so polluted by past industry that it poses a significant risk to the health of people and the environment. The word itself sounded distant, federal, abstract, but the reality was simple and local. Mercury, chemical waste, long-term pollution embedded in soil and sediment. Warnings went up. Studies were done, and cleanup began, slow and expensive. And one rule settled in that everyone around here knows by heart now. You don't eat the fish. From Saltville down through Kingsport, Tennessee, the river carries an invisible line, one you don't cross with a fishing pole and a skillet. Generations who grew up casting lines in those waters had to relearn what was safe, what was lost, and what would never fully come back, as a fish consumption warning exists to this day. The river still flows. It looks clean in places, peaceful, and even produces trophy fish. But the past is still in it. That's the part people don't always want to talk about. How a town can prosper, how it can rebuild, how it can shine for a while, and still carry the cost of decisions made long before most of its people were born. Saltville wasn't unique in that. Appalachia is full of places like this. Towns lifted up by industry, then left to reckon with what industry leaves behind. Coal, chemicals, timber, all of it wrapped in the same bargain. Work now, consequences later. And later always comes. For decades, there was no memorial of the 1924 Muck Dam disaster, no marker, nothing official to say this happened here. But the memory never really left. It lived in the way people talked about the river, in the way the elders watched the weather, in the way certain stories were told softly, without elaboration, because they didn't need it. Some folks said the valley never felt quite the same afterwards. Others said that was just time doing what time does. And maybe both those things are true. 100 years later, the town gathered to say the names out loud, to commemorate those who lost their lives that night. A granite monument was placed and candles lit. 19 bells rang out in the cold December air, one for each life lost. People stood in the silence at the hour the dam had failed, and the story was spoken publicly, not as rumor or memory, but as history. Not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge them, because in Appalachia, forgetting isn't the same as healing. Saltville's story isn't unique. The mountains are full of places shaped by industry, sacrifice, and silence. Coal towns, mill towns, chemical towns. Places where progress brought jobs and stability, and sometimes brought something else with it. What happened on Christmas Eve, 1924, wasn't just an accident of weather or engineering. It was the collision of necessity, trust, and risk. And the people who paid for it weren't decision makers or shareholders. They were families. They were children. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives under something they'd learned not to question. If you stand along the North Fork of the Holston River today, you won't see the dam. You won't see Palmertown. you'll see grass and water, and the slow work of time smoothing things over. But the mountains remember. They always do, and so do the people who live among them, because roots run deep in these hills and hollers, deep enough to hold communities together through loss, grief, and rebuilding. But shadows run long too, stretching out behind what we choose not to look at, waiting patiently for their existence to be acknowledged. That's the lesson that Saltville carries forward. Not one of blame shouted from the rooftops, but of a memory held firm in the hearts of a community. And sometimes, in Appalachia, that's the only justice a place like Saltville ever gets. This has been Roots and Shadows, the real Appalachia, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memory. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.